is the International Organization for Migration, and it's the UN Agency for Migration, dedicated to ensuring humane and orderly migration. So IOM currently has operations in 171 countries globally, including the GCC offices that we have in Kuwait, in Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, in Kingdom of Bahrain, in United Arab Emirates, and Qatar. So through that, we have more than 550 field offices across. And IOM works to unleash the potential of migration by assisting states to establish, expand, and enhance regular migration pathways while reducing irregular migration with a focus on diaspora engagement, labor migration, immigration and border governance, migration integration, or migrant integration rather, migration health, migration policy and law, migrant protection, support to governments for resettlement programs, and also supports communities affected by risks of displacement, whether caused by climate change, environmental degradation, or conflict, or other crisis situations. And through that instability with a focus on climate action, preparedness and disaster risk reduction, peace and recovery, conflict sensitivity, and protection in displacement settings. And in humanitarian settings, which we'll largely talk about in this session, IOM delivers life-saving assistance, supports displaced populations, and works with partners to strengthen preparedness, response, and recovery efforts, as well as a focus to provide durable solutions to internal displacement. So that is quite a broad spectrum, but all geared towards migration dynamics to basically provide that safety, humane, and orderly migration support. And we always recognize that our partners are essential to our work, and they are able to enable us to deliver effective whole of society migration solution with lasting impact. So that is, in a nutshell, what IOM is, quite broad, with different sectors and components, work streams that we work across all the countries that I've mentioned. And we are always honored to be able to support where we can. So with that, I want to say thank you so much for giving us this opportunity to basically present this session, which is a series of many, and where you're able to also get to know what we do, how we do it, and what is also important that we can be able to highlight that would be relevant to within what you're doing and how you're contributing on your day-to-day work. So having said that, and coming back now to our session on induction on emergency preparedness, where we're looking at working together to empower migrant workers. The United Nations Migration Report for 2024, it estimates that about 281 million international migrants in the world. And this equates to about 3.6% of the global population. And in GCC, based on UN-DESA analysis that we have for mid of 2024, we had an approximately of 30.6 international migrants. And even specifically to Kuwait, it's an estimated 3.32 million international migrants. So you can see largely the caseload within which we are talking about of the population that we have that is present. And with that then comes the whole aspect of the complex landscape, the ever-changing dynamics that are coming up, and also looking at where the private sector stands as a pivotal force and this indispensable partner to IOM, to other UN actors, to government and authorities, and with its unique expertise and resources for protecting migrant employees and being able to tackle emergency response efforts and contributing towards sustainable development. So there's that shift where we are also looking at private sector, not just as donor, but also as part of the partner that is able to support in dynamics as such, where we look at crisis dynamics. So with that, we'll start. These is the topics that we intend to cover, where we'll be looking at emergency preparedness, migrant inclusive preparedness. What does that mean? What are some of the vulnerabilities migrants are likely to face in crisis situations? We will touch on safe sheltering standards and the basic assistance. We'll look at what are the roles of the private sector in early planning and response, as well as business continuity and duty of care. And where we may not touch on anything specifically, then we could have the question and answer session and probably try and attempt to respond. So over to the next slide. Yeah, so when we look at emergency preparedness, it's where we are in a situation where crises are no longer rare events. We've been seeing what's happening globally, even within the region, conflict spillover, climate shocks, pandemics, infrastructure failures, and they are now part of the operating environment for businesses. So when a crisis hits, it doesn't just affect governments or humanitarian agencies. It affects employees, it affects work sites, it affects the supply chain and logistics, and as well as reputation. And preparedness is not about predicting the next crisis. It's about reducing disruption, protecting people, and keeping operations running. And companies that are able to plan ahead and be able to put a proper plan and scenario in place, then they are likely to also recover faster, also lose fewer staff, and also are able to face less legal and reputational risk. So we look at preparedness not just as a humanitarian add-on, but a risk reduction measure that then is a collective measure for all stakeholders to look into and be able to prepare for. So emergency preparedness focuses on the readiness and the capacity building to respond effectively, especially to sudden onset crises, where we are emphasizing on how immediately can we able to respond to that. So the timeliness, the volume, the quality, and the efficiency of the action during an emergency. And that is only possible when there is measures that have been put in place prior to the crisis happening in itself. Largely, we look at preparedness within a setup of where the risks or the crisis is this one straight linear dimension, but in real sense, we look at it from a cyclical evolving dimension where one crisis leads to another crisis. And before you even deal with the first crisis, you're having another evolution of another crisis. So it's a continuous measure. It's a progress. It's a process. It's just not a one-time action that you do and then you say we're prepared. It's you continuously are able to look at the gaps. You're continuously able to address the gaps as you go on. Next slide, please. So when we look at migrants inclusive preparedness, it's because most often in most of the plans that we have had in place, you realize that migrants are often overlooked in national preparedness and in contingency plans. Also, there's a dynamics of exclusion, which then increases their vulnerability, their protection risks, and also complicates it to some extent the operational assistance that might be provided during crisis. And therefore, when we look at migrant workers, we look at them as this essential partner and category of persons that we ought to also consider in the dynamics within which we are looking into preparedness, because migrant workers are essential to many sectors. They are in construction, they're in manufacturing, they're in services, they're in logistics, across the different sectors that we work in, even in businesses. And at the same time, you realize then that migrant workers are often more exposed during emergencies. And during crisis situations, there is the level of migrant workers who will find that their increased vulnerabilities more than any other affected population within that specific crisis. So it's important that we are able to look at what are the vulnerabilities that are unique for migrants as opposed to other populations, and not just that the focus should just be migrants, but the inclusion of migrants within the whole comprehensive preparedness measures that are put in place. So, and especially when we're looking at migrants who are at probably low level status, where they're likely to be in high risk areas, they're likely to be exposed to further vulnerabilities, they're likely to have issues with language barrier and documentation situations. And therefore, that also increases the vulnerabilities in the event that there's an emergency. And then in that dynamics, with all that put in place, you realize when migrants are excluded from emergency plans, from businesses, plans for business continuity, then they're likely to face further vulnerabilities and what we would call coping mechanisms that would then be very harmful. So that is why we look at advocating for migrant inclusive preparedness as an aspect that we would then term as a good risk management measure within any company when they are part of their staff composition involves migrants as well, and especially when we're looking at non-skilled migrant workers. Next slide, please. So one of the main tools that we have within IOM is what we call the MICIC guidelines. In full, it's the Migrant in Countries in Crisis framework. It's a guideline that is able to support, because it's a cross-cutting principles drawn from international law, voluntarily. It's non-binding guidelines. It has practices that can be able to support actions, and it also has operational tools that are able to guide and support in adequately putting in place preparedness that would be effective response in the event of a crisis. So it serves to inform and guide stakeholders' efforts to protect migrants in countries affected by conflict or disasters, and it also encompasses what we call all the phases of a crisis, where we are looking at pre-crisis, that is the preparedness, during the crisis itself, at the response stage, and post-crisis when we are looking at recovery. And this is also a useful tool even for private sector, because it plays a key role in what also they are able to operate within, and especially when we are looking at crisis situations. So the MICIC guidelines were developed specifically to address gaps that appear during emergencies. It focuses on all crises across the different phases of the crisis. And it's a practical guide, totally voluntary, that apply not only to government, to humanitarian responders, but to all actors, including the private sector. And for many companies, perspective of MICIC guidelines would help to answer questions like, how do we plan for emergencies involving migrant workers? What responsibility do employers realistically have in place? And what do we coordinate with authorities and other stakeholders before a crisis happens? And it helps in just having that early planning, which always we say is less costly anyway, if we are able to do it in a good way, because then it supports in effective and cost-efficient operations later on when there's an event of an emergency. So MICIC guidelines, as I've said, which is a framework comprising of cross-cutting principles. It cuts across the different phases of the crisis, the pre-crisis, the crisis event at response stage, and also post-crisis. But maybe key factors to also reckon is that it's state-led, it's voluntary, it's non-binding, but it's an operational guidance for stakeholders. And it plays that lead role in being able to support in the operational tools that each of these stakeholders would require in preparedness, in response, and even in recovery. It's aligned to the global frameworks that we have, like also being institutionally the global compact for migration, the 2030 SDG agenda, as well as also it cuts across what we refer to the humanitarian development peace nexus. And also the operational tools contribute to the global strategic plan that we have, as well as aligned to the private sector engagement strategy for 2023-2027 that we have in place and was published already. So that is what it looks like when we are talking about the MICIC guidelines, because then that inclusive aspect of planning is able to ensure that migrants are aware, we are aware of where they live as our workers. We are able to support them with the dissemination of real-time information as it's coming through. We're able to support them in evacuation to safe areas or safer areas, or if need be, probably outside of the country. And also we are able to see what barriers they might face accessing shelter assistance and other basic or essential needs that they may have. And that planning then supports in ensuring that there's that coordination in planning and preparedness, in the response, the operation aspect, as well as also towards the recovery and when things seem now to be working and aligning towards sustainable development or basically restoring and reconstructing. So that is one dynamics of it. When we look at the next slide, when we look at the different diversities of vulnerability in a crisis context and looking at migrants, first, a migrant is a person who is not of the host country. So their nationality is of another country. So based on that, the nationality comes with probably issues around race and ethnicity. They come around with language barriers. They come around with literacy levels, the migration status, which is their legal documentation. There is also the aspect of social isolation, socioeconomic status, age, gender, sexual orientation, religion differences, and also health status and disability are aligned within these vulnerabilities. And putting that to mind, then we are able to understand in an event that there's a crisis and during emergencies, these vulnerabilities tend then to increase very quickly. Because in a situation where a migrant has language barrier, for example, that means that this worker may not be able to get any evacuation notices, may not be able to get any information and alerts that are coming with a different language, because probably the language that is currently being used in a situation of a crisis or a crisis that is likely to happen quite rapidly is of the national country. So they are likely to face that barrier as a starting point. Then there's the aspect of the migration status, fear of authorities. So they tend to prevent themselves from accessing the official shelters that may have been put in place that could be able to support with safe sheltering, because they're not sure with their legal documentations not in place that they might go there and they have the fear of probably being deported or being discriminated as well. There's also the aspect of now looking at also the situations of age differences. Is it accessible to all gender groups? Is there a level of privacy within the shelters themselves? And also the dynamics of what assistance are they receiving there? Are they able to access? Is it equally accessible to everyone, or is it just for specific groups of persons? And as well also accessibility to persons with disability. And those are the protection issues that cut across for the migration groups that you might have in a situation of a crisis situation. So it's important to be cognizant of that, especially when we're looking at preparedness and planning and coordinating on the roles of who takes what response operation within a certain situation. So when we're looking at self-sheltering and provision of basic assistance, then some of the key principles we want to ensure is that the migrants and anybody else that is sheltering in these shelters, they feel protected, they have a level of safety, there's the level of privacy and dignity, and there's also the access to services. I think I've spoken a bit about this. But in addition to this, then as the basic assistance are being provided, that there is no that discrimination There is that feel of safety regardless of the migration status of age and every person. Then the respect to privacy and the family unit and the cultural practices of the different groups of the migrant and the population that is being sheltered within a certain shelter. And key and most important is a freedom of movement, that they don't want to feel that they are in what we would call like a detention center, like facility, that they feel they have the freedom of movement and there's the clear rules that help protect both the workers, the employers from the damaging allegation. So when we look at all that, then we are determining what a safe shelter is. Because when we look at access to basic services like water, sanitation, health, food, clothing, then it's equally being provided for all the population and not just specific group with alienation to other groups. When we look at discrimination and non-discrimination, it cuts across to all nationalities, regardless of their status, their age, their gender, and so on. So that is very important within the management of a shelter and in identification of the shelter as well as when we are looking at persons with disability, and especially in a situation where the crisis may have caused quite a big population to be injured and probably they're not able to access it just by walking. They might need to use wheelchairs, and then the shelter needs to be able to facilitate that as well. Next slide. Yeah, so in this slide, basically we would want to, and it's a good aspect also during the question and answer session to discuss further on how do we see the role of a private sector, and especially how is it critical in preparedness planning and in response? Because business employ large numbers of people. They control key infrastructure and often have faster operational reach than public systems. And within their large number of people, also we have the migrant workers as part of their staff population. And in many crises, employers are the first point of contact for migrant workers, and they're able to provide relevant information and communication channel even before governments or humanitarian actors can actually reach this population. So the effective preparedness depends on businesses being part of the planning and as well as the response. And in that aspect is even before a crisis, companies can be able to reduce these major risks with relatively simple steps that include identifying the risks to workers and the work sites, ensuring migrant workers are included in emergency plans, in coordination discussions that migrant workers are part of the classification of the populations that have been identified, and also they are able to also align that as well within their business continuity plans, along with the national system. Participating in what we call like simulation or drills, and being able to have the coordination platform where there's representation of businesses in it as well. This helps also build that trust so that when communication is laid down, especially to migrant workers who may be in isolation, they're able to trust the information that is coming and the communication that is guiding them into taking significant steps to be safer. And there's that clarity also in terms of understanding the population that you have, the language they speak, that they are more familiar with. Then there's a translation of the communication mediums that are used also are able to be effective, that the information is translated to the language that they are able to understand, and they are able to also be able to trust the medium within which that communication is coming through. So looking at preparedness, which ideally is before a crisis, then there's the need to look at how do we put all these together, the provision of safe spaces, the communication, understanding the population that is within the businesses, being able to ensure they are engaged in the conversations, in the planning, in the preparedness. They are engaged as well within the response, as well as also in the recovery stage after the crisis, as is described within the MIKI guidelines that we have talked about. So during a crisis, the priority is to act safely and ethically, especially because it's usually under pressure. But this includes ensuring that there's that safe evacuation, there's clear information provided, there's the support to access the shelters, because we have had scenarios where the shelters exist, but certain groups are able to access it while other groups are not able to access it. And therefore they find themselves in informal housing that expose them to protection risks. And also there is the dynamics of how do we coordinate with the authorities and other humanitarian actors who are present and are providing response and assistance to ensure that there is that comprehensive response and there is the access to basic services and assistance that the population that is within these shelters can be able to access. Next slide. Yeah, so within the MIKI guidelines, we have key recommendations and actions that are able to guide, and especially when we are looking at the preparedness level, where we are able to track information on crisis, we're able to collect this information, disseminate it in an effective way. We're able to empower even the migrant workers and the migrant population itself to help themselves. We're able to guide them in how they can be able to access support and response in the event of a crisis. We're able to incorporate migrants within the plans and the systems and the coordination mechanisms that are in place. We're able to involve them in the contingency planning processes. Then also, we have what we talked about as migrant-sensitive communication mechanisms. We're able to establish these coordination agreements with other coordination actors and humanitarian actors and the authorities, as well as that continuous capacity building for emergency response and recovery, being able to see what are the gaps that exist, how do we continue to address these gaps as we go on, because it's a process. And this supports then in having the effective response where it's timely, it's accurate, it's appropriate, and it's adequate across the different sectors that would be required and the needs that the population that would be affected would be needing. So with that, next slide. I keep forgetting to say next slide, so I go ahead of myself. So for private sector, where there's that shift where we're looking at being part of the preparedness partners and being part of the response as a partner, there's the different levels within which you can say you basically are able to play a crucial role to ensure that migrants are empowered, as well as you're able to contribute to the ethical recruitment process on their migrant workers, and as well as there is that integration of migrant-specific provisions in the contingency and in the workplace evacuation plans as well. And these supports then in establishing clear communication channels. There's clear basis on referral pathways as well. And also there's the mechanisms in place, what we call the complaints and feedback mechanism in place for the affected population to also equally be able to give feedback on the response, on the facilities that are in place, and how they can be improved to be able to ensure that they are safe, they have the dignity and the privacy that they require, they feel they are able to access the services that they require. And therefore, we have indicated basically that private sector is well placed and crucial for protecting and assisting migrant employees before, during, and in the aftermath of the crisis. And through the guidelines, the MIKI guidelines, we as part of the humanitarian actors, we can foster that collaboration. We can leverage on private sector expertise to be able to safeguard migrant workers at every stage of the crisis. We are able to ensure that even within the business continuity planning, which is closely linked to emergency preparedness, that there is that integration of the needs that migrant workers would require, especially during a crisis situation. So in all these facility is where there's this shift where we look at private sectors not just as donors and providing that financial support, but also coming together and being part of the coordination mechanism as preparedness partners. So that when we look at the MIKI guidelines, the tools that support us, they are also relevant tools that are able to support your preparedness planning, your business continuity plans, and you're able to have that integration that is aligned between the different documents, the national strategy, the national disaster plans that are in place, the humanitarian and the interagency actors coordination mechanisms, and this business sector that then is able to be aligned with that as well. Next slide, please. Yeah, so that is in a nutshell what MIKIK is all about when we are looking at working with private sector in emergency preparedness, as well as in response and in the overall preparedness planning. And I want to hand over to Tanya to take up the next session, please. Tanya, welcome.
Thank you, Winnie. And good morning to our colleagues participating in this consultation with private sector. Maybe before I move on to speak a little bit more about concretely how the situation affects migrant workers across the board, across all skill levels, across all types of contracts. If there is any feedback, if maybe someone would like to ask a couple of questions back to Winnie on how business, how private sector can engage with IOM around MIKIK, maybe we give that opportunity right now. If there is any immediate need for clarifications, or if someone would like to comment on what they have heard from Winnie. I'm looking at the participants. I can't see anyone raising their hand. Okay, so in that case, yeah, let me then, or write in the chat, exactly. That's of course the other opportunity. So while we see if there's any feedback on Winnie's presentation, let me continue a little bit, and maybe I'll try not so much to present to you how IOM is responding in such a situation, but what we already know about the situation, and maybe that can help to get a bit of a conversation going, because I'm very certain that everyone that is present in the room today is very much affected already. And I'm pretty certain that all of you are already experiencing disruptions in your supply chains. And then the question is, how do you react to that? So we as IOM, and Winnie was talking to that, we obviously, before we start thinking about how we can intervene, how we can support, we try to get a bit of an overview of the situation. And so in our case, we have reached out to migrant organizations that are working on the ground across the GCC, and that has given us a bit of a picture. What are the critical risks that the migrant workers are facing because of the slowdown of activities in the different sectors? Winnie mentioned already the main sectors. It's not only construction, but it's also tourism, it's hospitality, it's the food services, the hotels, all related industries, all infrastructure projects. And that is also because of the disruption of the transport systems and transport ways, that things can't get moved. So basically, people are being sent home under quotations, home, because what we see is, in fact, that most people are not able to return home because at the same time there is also closure of airspace. So people are effectively trapped in situations in the Gulf where they are more or less out of a job because they have been sent home. Basically with the, saying no job, no pay. And that creates serious situations, especially for low wage workers. But we have seen and we have heard that this is not only affecting low wage workers, it's also affecting skilled workers, even expats that are working in offices, that are working in finance, that are working in companies, large companies, because basically the workforce is being reduced. People are being told to take leave, to take, pending leave, or to take leave just because whether they have leave or not, so that basically the payroll can be reduced because that leave is without pay. And the low wage workers, or those that are actually working in the informal sector, and I guess those of you who have been around in 2019, 2020, this will sound very familiar. People working in the informal sector, people working in the domestic sector, they are not only losing the job, but they are losing basically their ways how to sustain their lives, because all of a sudden they are without their daily jobs, and that means that they have problems in making their ends meet. They don't have the daily income anymore to pay for their food or to pay for their medical supplies, and as we see that now, as the crisis is lasting longer, we see it more. They are not able to pay for their rents and for their shared accommodation. We are not even talking about money to pay for flight tickets to return back home. So what we then offer in such a situation, and I think you can move on to the next slide, please, is that we try to reach out to private sector. And I think this series of workshops that the American Chamber of Commerce is organizing in Kuwait is a prime example of how that can be accomplished. And we are very grateful, very thankful that we can be part of this series of workshops. We see that this is an initiative that is taken up a little bit across the GCC. I have been invited recently by another organization organizing a sort of closed meeting with private sector representatives last week, where we discussed also business continuity, duty of care. In the UAE, the Swedish Business Council is organizing meetings for their members on business continuity. What does it mean, force majeure, for business operations, and how can businesses cover themselves because of such external shocks in terms of meeting their commitments that they have, contractual commitments, when everything stops and you don't really know what to expect in the next 2 or 3 weeks. So these type of consultations with private sector are a very, very, very useful, a very valuable initiative where we can reach out to private sector to discuss exactly all these issues that we will deal with in more detail also in the next 2 sessions. What to do, what as a private sector can you do to support migrant workers who are facing these mobility limits, who have visa restrictions, How do you protect migrant workers when they run out of their medical supplies, their housing? What do you do and what can you do as responsible businesses to protect migrant workers in these situations and make them less vulnerable? And in the next slide, I think we are also going a little bit more in detail. What are the principles when we talk about duty of care that we basically have to apply principles of equality, non-discrimination, and also regardless essentially of what the migration status is of the migrant workers. When we want to provide this protection that Vinny was talking about. The longer the situation will last, it is clear that more migrant workers will find themselves in a situation where they do not have a work permit, a valid work permit anymore. And that's why it's even more important, that we think about how to protect migrant workers, even those who do not have a valid status anymore. We will have more of those people in that situation the longer this crisis is lasting. We need to prioritize, and we can see that already from the current situation, the immediate needs. We are talking about food, we are talking about access to medical assistance, meaning medication, medical supplies, especially those who are without social protection. And that's not only the people in the informal economy, that's also migrant workers who are not covered by national social security or private insurance schemes, to make sure that they have access to health services. And we need to think about how concretely businesses can, I say, come up with creative solutions to retain the workforce in order to continue business as usual. As difficult that is in a situation of such high uncertainty, but we do see some encouraging examples where companies are, for example, rather than sending people home or sending them on leave, they are basically trying to cut work time and share work time among more workers, just to avoid situations where some workers will be let off completely. If that means that those people are then in a situation where they can't really move because they can't also return to their countries of origin, but they can't also move on. And then they are stuck and they sort of have to make their ends meet without knowing when they will have a regular income again. I think there is another slide. So those who are still at work and who are following their profession, for those, obviously, the businesses, and I found that very interesting in last week's conversation, that there seems to be a bit of a distinction between migrant workers and expats, because talking about preparedness, some of the businesses they shared that they do have evacuation plans and staff security plans for expats, but that's basically where the preparedness stops. Whereas the migrant workers that are, employed a little bit further down in the supply chain, they are not part of these preparedness or contingency or evacuation plans. So I think that for those who are still in work, because they are essential, because companies can't do without their workforce, they also deserve the necessary protection in the workplace. And that, for example, is especially important for those that are really exposed to the current security risks because of the war and because of the attacks. Those that are working in construction sites, those that are working in oil and related industries and facilities, those that are working, well, as we have seen, even in hotels, they are targets because they are serving infrastructure and facilities that are targets of these attacks. So if we want to protect some of our co-workers that are working, then that protection needs to be extended to all workers, following the principles of human rights and the principles that apply, especially also in crisis situations. It's important that we communicate with all of our workers in languages that they understand. I think that is something that Vinny already mentioned. And we need to provide safe, not only living, but also working conditions for all migrant workers. I think, next slide, please. We will go in much more detail on how private sector, how businesses, how companies can, in fact, try to continue their businesses, which I understand is also very much the slogan. I don't know if slogan is the right expression, the wish of the governments of the Gulf, that basically, people should continue business as usual to the extent possible, but also what that means in terms of protection for all workers in the Gulf, the national ones, the migrant ones, the expats, in terms of adopting more flexible work arrangements rather than following the almost common approach of no job, no pay, providing safe transportation and security measures, safeguards for migrant workers that are working in very exposed jobs, very exposed work sites as well, and ensuring financial protection through, I think you are all familiar with the wage protection system. This is now even more important than before, because not having any income means many, many other vulnerabilities. Food security, housing, as I said, no access to health, to medication, and that can really exacerbate the situation of individuals. And obviously, the first group that we are thinking of are low-wage workers. But believe me, that insecurity, financial insecurity, is also very much affecting workers at other skill levels, including our so-called expats. And lastly, that even in a crisis situation like that, how we need to ensure that in our supply chains, we promote ethical recruitment and we do not allow for agents somewhere in that supply chain to benefit from that situation and take fees from migrant workers to find any possible solution for them to get another work permit or to prolong their visa, etc. Maybe my last remark would be that obviously we can work and we can do quite a bit in supporting private sector, but all of that work has to be guided and has to take place in the framework of national strategies and national plans, because the governments are in fact not inactive. I mean, we have seen examples in Kuwait, we have seen examples in Bahrain. You know, the longer the more, we see how governments are also trying to introduce, for example, price caps for food to avoid that, you know, the food prices just go up through the roof. And people are already without income, right? So how are they supposed to pay for their daily subsistence? So the governments are already putting measures in place also when it comes to the prolongation of visa, knowing that the people are stuck right now. So everything we do has to be guided and has to be informed by those measures that the governments are also putting in place. But there is certainly ample room for private sector to go beyond what is required by national governments. And I think that is why our colleagues from the American Chamber of Commerce have invited us to speak to you what it is that private sector can initiate. And we are very happy to be here with you and to discuss with you in more detail how we can exactly support you if you want to take action to protect the migrant workers that are currently sort of stuck in the Gulf. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Tanya, and thank you, Winnie. We have one question. We have the Real Estate Union here on the call. And one of the things that we have been discussing is, again, not being able to get to shelters that the government has built, especially if you are someone who's vulnerable, maybe you have a disability or you have young babies. Is there a list that they can potentially utilize so that they can have this in their basements, in their buildings, that their tenants can utilize should they not be able to get to a shelter on time?
Well, I would say that, and I would invite also our colleagues from IOM Kuwait to take the floor as well, because there might be, you know, measures that the government is also putting in place, you know, provisions that the government is providing in such situations that they might know better. But in principle, I would say that especially in Kuwait, where I understand that the government was already very active to ensure inclusion of peoples with disabilities. I would think that, you know, that access to shelter inside the buildings, in the basements, is something that is probably already prescribed by law. I would be surprised if it was not, but maybe the colleagues from IOM Kuwait know more about it.
Yeah, yes, dear. Yes, dear. This is Imam from IAM Kuwait. Okay, I'll put it this way. Regulation are there. Some, let's say, smart buildings are already equipped in. We can't say there is any let's say any fully activation of especially for the disabilities residences or in the shelter. But saying that, the government actually mentioned several times especially during this conflict, that there are four main shelters are fully equipped, and they are guided signs with everything, with all facilities for handicaps as well. I haven't practiced it myself. I didn't visit there, and I think it's not yet open for public
Yeah.
unless there is something actually a need for that. So we would say yes and no.
Thank you
If,
for this additional clarification, Imam. Yeah. And I think Lena is also sharing with us in the chat that there are women's shelters for Kuwaiti nationals, and then there is also shelters, as we know, as IOM for domestic helpers. So I have actually seen how that looks like in a video that was shown to us by the Kuwaiti government. So there are shelters for domestic helpers in particular as well, yeah. So I'm sure that they are also very much being used right now, yeah, because domestic workers are, again, like during COVID-19, they find themselves in a situation where their employers, where their, let's say, landlords are leaving Kuwait for security reasons, and they basically leave them behind. And so they are without job and they are without housing. So that is probably, you know, the first address where these women would then go, the shelter, because they don't have anywhere else to go.
Thank you. The main thing was, if you are unable to get to one of the shelters, there are plenty. Of course, there are plenty, and they're all very well equipped. But if you're unable to get to them, it's good, especially if you live in an apartment, it's good for owners of buildings to know what they can do themselves to prepare their basements if
Yeah.
there is an immediate action that needs to be taken for people to shelter in place and they can't get to the space on time. So
Yeah.
are there guidances that they can follow in order to have that ready and be proactive?
Let me come in here. Within the preparedness planning, part of that would be like developing what we would call the standard operating procedure, that then this would support in communicating to the owners of the basements or the apartments in how they can then be able to prepare such spaces as safe spaces for not just migrant workers, for anyone who is seeking refuge at that point during a crisis situation. And it's not complex because it's simply being able to develop, bringing different stakeholders together, having a mapping of which are the specific identified apartments that have basements that could be able to be used as safe spaces, developing that emergency standard operating procedure, having that participation of the stakeholders in place, and then disseminating this information. And in this information, it's why it's critical, because this information needs to be translated in different languages. It needs to also go through different mediums to ensure that it's accessible to everybody and it's understood, so that a person who is on the north doesn't need to cross and put themselves at risk going towards the south. They're able to be aware of what is in the surrounding to be able to seek and access it quite easily as a safe sheltering space. So those are some of the things that we would be able then to work towards. And it's not complex. I mean, being able to bring together, practically engage key stakeholders from the businesses that are in Kuwait and other stakeholders to do preparedness planning is not complex. It's being able to ensure that the different industry associations, the migrant workers associations, representatives are able to be put in place to provide that discussion and that coordination model. And then from there, it's very easy to be able to develop these simple emergency standard operating procedures and ensure that there is that participation towards the preparedness platform, that are already in place and aligned with the authorities' preparedness planning that is already in place. Yeah.
Thank you, Winnie. And one last question, because we're above the hour. You guys spoke about force majeure and the discussions that you've been having with a few other business councils about it. How should companies balance operational continuity versus employee safety in especially high-risk situations?
Tanya, you want to take that?
From my point of view, when you do continue operations, like high-risk operations, like in the oil fields or on the construction sites, it is just important, again, to have safety measures in place, safe places where the workers can go when the sirens start alarming, that those security and safety measures and safe places are available for everyone. And we are not basically stopping at the level of the mid-level management or higher, but we are basically providing safety measures for all the workers, all the way down to the simply unskilled workers that do the very manual jobs. So I think business continuity is what is a priority to the extent that the companies decide to continue their operations despite there is a war going on and despite that there are attacks. They just have to make sure that the safety measures that they put in place are non-discriminatory and include everyone. That would be my take on it.
Thank you so much for that. And again, thank you both for this wonderful and very informative presentation. We look forward to the second session, and we will be sharing this presentation as well with all the participants. If there's any material that either of you would like to also share a part of this presentation, please do let us know, and we will share it with the audience.
I think you have in the presentation the links. You have the link to the MICIC guidelines on the slides that Winnie presented, and there is a link to guidelines that have been prepared actually during the COVID-19 crisis, specifically for employers, and how to deal with migrant workers during such situations. And the link to that is in the slides that I presented. So I think those are the two key resources that the colleagues can have a look at. And if there is a need to discuss more on any of those aspects or measures that are being proposed, I think we can take that up in the follow-up meetings. Yeah. So thank you also very much for the invitation, and thank you very much to the colleagues for attending this first session.
Thank you. Thank you all, and I wish you all a really good day ahead. And again, we very much look forward to the second session. Thank you, guys.
Thank you very much, Paula.
Thank you, everyone.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.